Hello and welcome to BRICS Innovations and Solutions, a special program of World Insight with Tian Wei, marking the BRICS Summit this year. When the BRICS platform was formed, it was considered as an innovative idea that helped the world to see hopes in the aftermath of a serious financial crisis. Almost a decade later, BRICS countries not only have made great contributions to the world's economy, but also help further innovate the international system. But there's something more today. These countries become engines of innovation and the best places to experiment for new ideas, be it technical innovation, social innovation, or systematic innovation. Of course, the picture is not rosy all the time, as it is no secret that some of these countries are facing with grand challenges too. But as they say, one of the best ways to get out of the tight boxes is to invent your way out. So, in our special program today, we are going to do reality check of the innovations going on in the BRICS countries and explore the ways innovations are taking place in these countries, the potential of BRICS as a whole to help innovate our world in the near future. And now let's jump right into the discussion by picking the minds of the representatives of these BRICS countries. They are in our Beijing studio. Professor Bai Lu, who is a professor of neuroscience from Tsinghua University. Welcome, Professor. Yeah. And also Diego Vinicius Martins. I hope I pronounced your name right, sir.
Perfect.
Political analyst from Brazil joining us in Beijing. Meanwhile, in Cape Town, South Africa, we have Professor Ari Sitas, chair of the South Africa BRICS think tank. Joining us in New Delhi, in India, Mr. Vivan Sharan, visiting fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. Joining us in Moscow, in Russia, Alexander Lukin, professor and director of East Asian and SCO studies at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. What a pleasure to have a whole panel of you gentlemen on this crucial issue of innovation. Let's jump right into the topic of technological innovation. If I can, beginning from Brazil, set an example for all of us. How should we understand the scene of innovation in Brazil? Some of big names, interesting case study you can share with us. If you can, 45 seconds.
Okay, I think that innovation in Brazil is still struggling to start the real innovation in Brazil. As we were commenting before the beginning of the program, I think that the big problem in Brazil nowadays is the education system. We still have so many problems with the education system in Brazil that we didn't start the real technology revolution in Brazil. Of course, there is some big names, some unicorns in Brazil, a big fintech, Nubank is a big fintech that's creating a new way how you can use credit card in Brazil, but I still fear about this technology sector in Brazil.
All right, what about India? Let's go to India now. Mr. Sharan, you probably could help us understand better about the scene in India. They say, well, a lot of technicians and computer scientists are all coming from India. What about the scene of innovation? Reality check.
Well, the reality check is that, globally, if you look at trends in innovation in advanced countries, many jurisdictions like the EU and the US are at an inflection point now when they need to explore exponential leaps in innovation to continue to grow economically. India stands at slightly a different crossroads. It is 30 years behind in that sense in the innovation cycle. And therefore, even incremental innovation in India stands to benefit the economy significantly. So what we see in India is that we've always been a service sector-led economy since we've liberalized in the early 90s. And so we see a lot of service sector innovations that we can discuss further in your show. And a lot of those innovations in turn are also connected to the internet economy as it proliferates in India.
I see. South Africa, of course, in a totally different continent. The scene there is about how to reestablish a system that's going to encourage innovation. Professor Sitas, you probably help us understand better.
Yes, although we are building our science and technological capacity very rapidly, the difficult challenge is how to translate all those know-hows into something that leads to an inclusive economic growth trajectory. So our challenge at the moment is to learn from each other in a cooperative spirit of BRICS in order to achieve a win-win situation in terms of including all our populations in the country and in the Southern African region into a pattern of innovation that gets us out of poverty and inequality.
Great point. What about from Russia? Professor Lukin, even though you are a geopolitical scientist, but I'm sure you're also very focusing on the innovative scenes of your country.
Well, Russia has been for a long time famous for inventing various things, but it was not very active in putting these things into production. Russians historically invented many things like, radio, television, helicopters, even trains, but they couldn't produce them actually. So this system does not work very well. And until now, we have this problem. Russia still has quite advanced technology in some areas. For example, military, India and China buys a lot of Russian advanced Russian weapons. It has some technology in, say, atomic energy. It has technologies in space research, and but these are all remnants of the Soviet time.
That's right.
I still remember the time when Russian-Chinese trade, let's say Soviet-Chinese trade, was 40% export from Russia of machinery and equipment. Now it's vice versa. So we need assistance and help of other countries like China and India for implementing our innovations into real production and make it a real economy.
Well, at the very beginning of the discussion, Professor Lukin already bring up some initiatives to work together. Great spirit, by the way, gentlemen. Let's go to Professor Lu here in Beijing. You neuroscientist yourself.
Yes.
From Tsinghua University, one of the foundations, shall I say, to prop up all these intellectuals here in China, scientists.
Yeah.
What about the Chinese reality check?
Solving problems in a creative way. And
Great
that
point.
creative way has to be practical. So over the years, in the last maybe over 10 years, decades, I saw transformation and innovation being applied into society. And then the one big thing that I saw was that innovation has a business model innovation, there's also technology innovation. I saw a transition from more business model innovation towards more technology innovation over the last several years, and it's becoming more and more innovation in technologies. And I would say a real good innovation has to have a huge impact, and an impact to the society, to the industry, and better yet, impact to people's life.
Right.
So we see more and more of those innovations in China now.
Give me some examples, very specifically.
Well, one particular innovation that we can almost live without is WeChat, which is the product developed by Tencent. And WeChat is a combination of phone and answering machines and you name it. It's communications. we cannot.
It's essential.
Yeah, it's essential things that we can live without.
Among the 5 countries, 3 of them, South Africa, Brazil, and Russia, talk about the paramount challenges: inclusive growth, education,
Exactly.
and manufacturing capability linked with the scientific innovation, how to develop. And at the same time, we see 2 at the other camp, China and India, talking about how much we have achieved and how much life has changed as a result of our innovations. Very interesting perspectives. So shall I maybe pick up the brains from India and also China to talk about this? Before we handle the challenges of the other countries, let's just say China and India both are being considered as engines for innovation in different ways. Are they going to be competitors in this regard, or are they likely to complement each other about this? I'd like Mr. Sharan from New Delhi to speak first. Mr. Sharan.
I'm going to focus my intervention on technologies that have gone to market and that have produced returns to those that have invested in those technologies. And we have similar problems to Russia in that regard, in that we have not been able to take enough of our public and private sector research and development to the market, which is something that Silicon Valley is arguably perhaps the best at from among all global peers. But as far as China is concerned, I see a huge amount of complementarity in the Indian market. You know, a large number of investments into digital payments, into e-commerce, and even into replicating and recreating models that we've seen proliferate in China, disseminated and diffused through these channels of capital. We see a lot of Chinese investments in all of these growth sectors in India. Also the taxi market, the taxi aggregators. So I see, you know, the innovation cycle unfortunately still begins at Silicon Valley because they're the best at going to market. Europe is better than America in terms of fundamental research and development even today, but Silicon Valley is much better at taking those innovations to market and creating value out of those innovations. And I think the challenge for both China and India is very similar, and it's something that we need to grapple with together, which is how do you generate those surpluses, generate that value that you can reinvest into innovation cycles so that you get an edge over advanced countries.
All right. Professor Lu, you ardently listen to your Indian counterpart. Here are some of the things I think Mr. Sharan actually carefully raised. One is the role of the market vis-a-vis the role of the policies from the government.
Right.
And the other is some of the common challenges BRICS countries are facing as a result of this development stage. What would you say?
Well, first of all, let me say that, I mean, you raised the issue of a competition with complementary, and I think as a scientist by nature, we're competitive, and competition is good to drive science and technology. But I would say the competition right now for China especially is not really among the BRICS countries, but rather we're facing competition with the more developed countries like the US and West countries. And we see more and more complementary among BRICS countries. And for example, it's always persuasive if we take an example, right?
That's
right.
Right.
For example, Xiamen as a mobile phone company it's got been quite successful in India, for example.
And that
right?
is only one of them. And
Yeah.
there's Didi, there's
many,
Alibaba, there is Tencent,
Right.
I guess, all of
Right.
them.
Yeah, but I see, you know, for this spirit of BRICS country cooperation, I think we should do more and more in reaching out and then perhaps bringing in, you know, developing cooperations and collaborations among the BRICS countries.
That is an interesting thing. I want to go to Professor Sitas in South Africa because you talk about inclusive growth in your country, how to incorporate innovation, make sure it's going to be for everybody. Here's the thing. These BRICS countries, you know, we have some commonalities, right? We have huge markets. We have really rising middle class. A huge amount of talent as well. And also some quite advanced innovations, technological speaking. Professor Sitas, do you think interactions among the BRICS can really help all of us to improve and to so-called inclusive growth?
Yes, well, that is the challenge. You know, our education and scientific sectors are doing top-end innovation and research work. But it's that translation into now the incredible needs that are in Africa and in Southern Africa and South Africa. On the field of health, for instance, how do innovations in health and preventative health have an impact in everyday life? We're looking for health monitoring equipment that will help us fight against malaria. resistant TB, and all HIV/AIDS. All these areas involve scientific research and innovation that is taking place on an everyday basis in our universities, in our technical schools, and in collaboration with other BRICS countries.
Professor Lukin, once again, Professor Sitas from South Africa raised that interesting point, which is the role of the government, the role of the policy, the role of the private sector. Is that also an issue for Russia?
Well, I think that there is a myth now that the Western education is kind of better than in our countries. This is a complete mythology. I have a doctorate, for example, from Oxford University. I can tell, and I relatively better among our 5 countries. I know relatively better the educational system in China, Russia, and India, and I can tell you that the level is much higher in our countries. But why a lot of people go to the West, to the United States? Who are the people who are involved in IT technology research, for example, and companies in the United States? They are Indians, Russians, and Chinese, and people from other countries. So the advantage is that the conditions there for work are better. The investment climate, income, and that kind of stuff. So I think if we need innovation in our countries, we need to cooperate in creating this more favorable conditions for business, for research. Our education is okay. It's even better than in the West. I'm quite sure about it.
All right. Professor Lukin, very confident about the educational system in Russia and elsewhere in the BRICS countries. Let's put that aside, but policy. Mr. Martins, Professor Lukin is talking about the role that the government could play, the civil society could play to create this favorable environment for talents to grow and for innovation to be encouraged. Mr. Martins, is that a common challenge? How can we do that? How can we work as a whole to encourage those mechanisms established?
I think the best thing that the government can do for the society is do less. I think as far as I'm concerned, I think a liberal approach to the market is the best way to improve the growth of the society. You must let the people work and people study what they want to study. So in Brazil we have a lot of problem because we have a big state, and a big state need money, and they absorb the money from the society. In the end of the day, the bureaucracy is only creating problem to the people. So less intervention of the government would be a good thing for my country.
But you're from the private sector, so is it fair when you say that? Let's go to another guest who are not necessarily from the private sector, maybe the Indian guest. Mr. Sharan, do you agree with your Brazilian counterpart? The role of the government vis-a-vis the role of business?
In India's context, this holds equally true. One of the biggest deterrents to scientific research, innovation, going to market, commercialization, monetization is in fact the government. And I can give you a very specific example of our creative sector, where we still have in our broadcasting industry, in your industry in India, we have price controls by government on broadcasters. And you would recognize the fact that the content ecosystem is one which can survive business cycles, which can survive ups and downs and global slowdowns and protectionism and so on and so forth, because the proposition of content is so compelling. It doesn't need borders. It just needs to be catering to a niche, and it needs to be good. And in our country, we are still pricing content, but the government is involved in the business of pricing content. So it's just one example. And I think the role of the regulator needs to be nuanced in all of our countries. They need to take a step back to understand markets, especially as technology markets in particular are evolving much faster than policies and regulations can keep pace.
We heard your voice over there, and there's going to be a conference, among the business leaders of the BRICS countries. I'm sure they're going to raise their voices as well. Professor Lu, you want to say something? I'm sure you are on this point.
I perhaps on this point have slightly different views from the two previous guests.
I guess we have all agreed to disagree. Go ahead, sir.
And this is based on what I saw. I think there are two sides. There are two major driving forces for innovation. One is the private sector. Of course, I'm a believer of how market could drive innovation, but there's also a top-down driving force, and this is perhaps government. And we should not perhaps see government as a whole entity, but different parts of the government, local government versus the central government. And what I saw in China is that the government governments at the different levels are doing two things right. One is funding. Funding for innovation is increasing over the last 30 years. For this is the driving force for innovation, for basic research and for technology development. So this is one thing that's great. And the other thing that I think the government is doing right is develop all kinds of policies to bring talents. There are a lot in China, perhaps in India as well. There are many talents who are trained overseas, but with the policy, with the incentives, the Chinese government is bringing a lot of talents back. What I say is not whether government should be. Yeah, I myself and perhaps you, or we're all trained in the West and come back to China. I think it's not the government per se, but instead how the government should play its role. And there's maybe a way to explain that. That is, if the government is this way, it's sometimes impede or interfere with the innovation. But if the government is this way, is to support and is to promote innovators to do their innovation, then I think government has its role.
I see all the gentlemen are nodding their heads on this point. Obviously, there's a lot to discuss about innovation, particularly technological innovation. We have to bring an end to this part for now, but we are going to continue our discussion about innovation in the BRICS countries and its role for solutions. You're watching BRICS Innovations and Solutions, a special program of World Insight with Tianwei marking the BRICS Summit this year. We will be back after this break.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
I miss Xiamen.
Xiamen is my home.
Love to teach yoga and I love Xiamen.
I love Amoy.
You're watching BRICS Innovations and Solutions, a special program of World Insight with Tianwei marking the BRICS Summit this year. I'm Tianwei. Good ideas and successful innovation can never come into being without failures, some say, which are usually followed by more intense human interactions, arguments, even conflicts, and certainly a lot of discussions. If you look at the BRICS, it is going through a period in which every country among them are working to reinvent itself and interacting ever more intensely with one and another and among themselves as well. Where further innovation would lead the BRICS to? What about BRICS Plus? A brand new idea? And where are the fundamental sources of innovation in the BRICS countries? How much does governance and leadership matter? Let's once again jump into the discussion and tap into the knowledge and insights of our BRICS panelists. I'm going to introduce them very briefly. From China, Professor Bai Lu. From Brazil, Mr. Diego Martins.
Yes.
From South Africa, Professor Ari Sitas. From India, Mr. Vivan Sharan. From Russia, Professor Alexander Lukin. So, gentlemen, let's go to the social innovation, systematic innovation. Professor Lukin, as a geopolitical professor, this you have to talk a lot about. At the time when it was invented, 2009, great new idea, BRICS. But now, does it need a new way to reinvent itself as circumstances changes and these countries facing new sets of challenges? Professor Lukin.
Economy in general and technology was not the main reason why our 5 countries come together. The main reason is, I would say, geopolitical. We need, if we are talking about innovation, that would be innovation in the system of global governments. Our 5 countries were dissatisfied with the system of global governments, which only represented the interests of the developed world. And so what we should work in this area is mostly trying to change, of course, in an evolutionary, not revolutionary way, to make the current system of global government represent the interests of the developing world, of let's say, not non-Western world. President Xi Jinping also said it on many occasions that we need to change the current system of global governments.
Okay, have we succeeded, Professor Sitas from South Africa? How much have we succeeded?
We have to get right the innovations that allow the public, the private, and communities to work within our countries and across our countries. We have begun. There are many resources who are going into these forms of cooperation between our countries. But we can take anything from climate change to people-centered development. All these elements have to come together. If we succeed, we will move out of the models that demand there is one solution for the whole world. We do want to recognize our differences, and we do want to achieve similar goals. So it is in that art of getting the public, private communities working properly together, both within and across our borders.
That's an interesting point.
If we manage that,
that's an interesting
would
point.
have had the innovation of the 21st century.
That's an interesting point. Mr. Martins from Brazil, public-private partnership, it is a solution, even coming from the United Nations. But, you know, besides the government, that synergies being created among the BRICS countries from the grassroots on, among communities, different kinds, interacting directly with one another. This is a great hope, but not easy to achieve, given how little we know each other.
Yes.
We really know each other through the third party, right? We look at the English newspapers in order to know each other. That's only one example. So the question is, how can we do that, what Professor Sitas just said?
I think a deeper knowledge of ourselves is quite important for the group. Cultural exchange is vital for the group. We must learn more. From my perspective, the Brazilian must learn more about the African history, the Indian history, and Chinese history, and Eurasian history. Yes, of course. And I think our people must learn that because we are a diverse people. Myself, my mother, for example, she's from African origin. My father is white, and Brazilian people is no, because we have very different people together, and we learn how to live together.
Yeah.
Yes, and diversity is quite important thing for any country. And I believe that Brazil can at least teach something to the other countries.
Professor Lu, do you agree with that? That now the source of reinventing ourselves are actually coming from more in-depth understanding among us, and then come up from the grassroots on with some initiatives that would work on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Is that what you're also trying to suggest?
Absolutely. I believe that with more and more understanding among different people, then there will be more and more opportunities coming up for collaboration. I mean, the BRICS countries themselves creates a huge market. The route has to be, smooth, and communication has to be open and effective. So I think among many Chinese entrepreneurs, they have now come to realize it's important to reach out and to bring in people from other BRICS countries.
What about the BRICS platform itself? Earlier with 5 countries, these 5 countries now seem to be, economically speaking, quite different from one another when it comes to policy and realities. And there are suggestions coming from the Chinese side and some of the others, from Russian as well.
The Belt
talking
and
about
Roads.
the Belt and Roads, and also BRICS Plus, meaning bringing other players from developing and emerging economies, having bigger, in a way, body for interaction among ourselves. And Professor Lu, what about that, and what it takes to be there?
Well, I think in China, over the last 35 years, I would say, we have adopted not a top-down design, but explore as we go kind of a policy, and I think it works very well. So in the BRICS case, first among 5 countries, working out of some of the details, working out of some of the obstacles, and then we can extend to other countries. And I think among these, learning is very important. You learn your way through.
That's right.
By learning by doing, right? So over the time, I think we have developed, we have learned quite a lot of things. We have come to a few lessons, if you will.
Mr. Sharan from India, I mean, if you think about this, since big data is being mentioned, I'm going to explore a little bit more here. Big data, emerging economies, developing countries, wow, this is going to be wonderful because there are a huge amount of data coming from these economies. But how can we incorporate them, even on the big data, the issue itself? And what is the mechanism to interact and to make sure it's going to serve all our purposes, and public and the private sectors alike? That is going to be the challenge. Will something like a BRICS Plus be able to help that and enlarge our pools, whether it's big data or talents or markets or initiatives, stronger support for them to be on the international stage? I think that's the question people are increasingly looking at, Mr. Sharan.
I think the problem here, if we try to contextualize within BRICS, is we don't have conversations about data protection, about data flows, where we have understood what to do with data at rest, but because data is oftentimes in transit, and it transits across all of our geographies, depending on where servers are located, depending on where these data assets are being created. I think, since data does not observe borders, it's even more imperative for us now to ensure that at the very minimum, BRICS talk to each other to put in place the requisite ring fencing so that we are allowed to share our data with each other without any law or any regulation weighing in a way that data is locked and the potential of data is locked up.
Professor Lukin.
And that is that also makes the industry accountable.
Yeah, it seems that all your colleagues are suggesting not just one layer, but several layers. One is that the BRICS platform can be enlarged to have bigger pool of talents and benefits together. The other thing is how to increase the different layers of discussions within the BRICS countries. Big data is only one of those examples. So Professor Lukin, it seems that we have a lot of work to do for this year and the years to come, Professor Lukin. Are we going to be efficient enough to come to conclusions and building mechanisms?
BRICS, by the way, is already working on various layers. It works on this kind of global governance level, but there are some projects and ideas on specific cooperation in various areas, including those that were mentioned there. For example, climate change, biotechnology, and many others. So it is developing, and it is developing in the right direction. As for enlargement, I think it is generally possible to have more influential countries in this group, and I think it was a good idea for China to invite 5 more countries to this summit in Xiamen this year. But we should discuss it so that those countries were, because the idea of BRICS that the countries that joined it were kind of representatives, rather big countries with their own interests, and they represented their continents. So we should think about which countries from various continents we should join.
People before talk about the BRICS as if it was a reflection of so-called the South-South cooperation. But when you look at the BRICS closer, these are real emerging economies. These are economies huge. These are economies that are bear with a huge population of its own. So what is likely to be the future taste of BRICS or BRIC Plus? What is going to be the commonalities among these countries on this platform? I think that is a fundamental question that those that are going to this year's BRICS has to be really thinking about. Your take, Professor Sitas.
Yes, you mentioned earlier about the multi-layered challenge we're facing. And I think for us in South Africa and in the broader African continent, we understand that youth, design, digital pathways will have to come together to create the new dynamism within the continent and across in the BRICS domain. So it's youth, it's civil society and community, it's women, it's all kinds of social sectors that need to be brought into conversation. And these digital pathways allow this to happen. So that is where we need to innovate and organize ourselves in the BRICS domain. The youth is an incredibly mobile force, both intellectually these days and physically. And in getting youth to work closer together in the BRICS domain and in further countries where they come from, in our education systems, right, in our community associations, then we will start seeing results for the future.
Professor Sitas, of course, is for incorporate all kinds of players into the discussion. But before we go, Professor Lu, the question is still very important. That is, what is the nature of this BRICS, right?
Right.
Earlier, it was all about economic clout. And now people are saying, as all of you are saying, there has to be more synergy. There has to be more different layers. And then people are saying, probably there have to be more players. There has to be a bigger voice if we want to really change. So your take, you're not representing the Chinese government, but certainly represent one of those Chinese intellectuals active in this discussion.
Yeah, see, well, from my perspective, how do we define or come up with the BRICS in the first place? Well, I would say when a collection of countries, we're not an organization, the collection of countries, there must be some common features. And I see the common features are, they're not in a very well advanced economic status, but in the meantime, they're representing fast-growing economy with the energy, passion, and perhaps innovation. So that's what's bringing the BRICS countries together. And now we're adding more countries, and I think adding more countries with similar features. And overall, it's, I would say, bring to this group not as a comment myself, but more of question. That is, when we're going towards that route, that is, are we developing a, how do I say, a new world order, if you will? That is, in the past, it's US dominated and Western countries, and then perhaps developing countries. But with this BRICS to begin with, and then BRICS Plus, and then perhaps South-South cooperation, and perhaps there will be a new world orders emerging. That is, whether these countries could be a major player in not only world economy, but in world order, in world politics.
We're going to see what's going to happen. Before we go, we want to have one sentence, gentlemen, and one sentence only about what needs to be handled, your wish for this year's BRICS Summit. Let's begin with Brazil.
I believe we need more cooperation, not economic only, but social cooperation, I think, is quite important for the group.
Russia.
I think for better cooperation, our 5 countries should be friendly to each other. I think that Russian-Chinese friendship is a very good example.
Wonderful. India.
I think the objective of BRICS has always been to tackle some of the largest challenges that confront us and are common to us. And I think, therefore, it is imperative that we begin to discuss the future of work in the face of automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all of these technological developments that are going to change the very social fabrics of our countries.
China.
Well, I think when it comes to BRICS countries and BRIC Plus, it's important to have our common interest above our individual interest. So having an enterprise thinking is very, very important.
All right. Last but certainly not least, South Africa.
Another world is possible based on mutual cooperation.
Bai Lu, Diego Martins, Ari Sitas, Vivan Sharan, Alexander Lukin. Gentlemen, I really appreciate your efforts. You're coming from all over the world, different time zones. Because of your attention to the BRICS and your hope for this better in the future, you're coming together. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you. Really appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for today. Our special program, BRICS Innovations and Solutions. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN in your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. We wish the BRICS Summit a great success. Bye for now.